Welcome to part C of this Unit 6, and what I'm going to be doing in this part is just talking a little bit about the theory of supply chains and some of the concepts that we've talked about already to kind of summarize it. So, supply chains. Supply chains, by definition, are the linkage, or we could also say the interconnectivity of different companies that are responsible for producing and delivering a product to a company. Now, you've probably heard the expression before that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And this is also true for supply chains too. So it's very important that all of the companies that are in this linkage of chains are performing well so that the services and the delivery of the product to the customer are what meets the customer expectation. Now, supply chains are certainly not new. The Egyptians used supply chains to build the pyramids, so they had to get those boulders and those rocks somewhere from some quarry, someplace away. They had to put them on some type of barge or boat and float them down the Nile River to the location where they were building the pyramids. Then they had to move the blocks over to the side of the pyramid where the stonemasons could work on them. So essentially they had supply chains. So supply chains are not new. They've been around for thousands of years. What is new is the emphasis in the management of supply chains or supply chain management. So supply chain management really has only been around as a concept for about the last 25 to 30 years. And what we have learned in the last 25 to 30 years is that companies that are able to manage their supply chains and to reach out and try to manage not only their customers' supply chains, but also be involved in understanding and possibly managing their customer's customer supply chain, and also the management not only of your supplier's supply chain, but also the suppliers who supplied them or your supplier's supply chain. So when companies are able to successfully manage their supply chain, a great deal of financial benefits accrue. Profits increase very significantly. And what companies have learned over the last 25 years is that investments in technology, investments in training, investments in other techniques, improve processes that improve their supply chain performance will pay for themselves very quickly and return even more profits to the bottom line. The management of supply chains becomes more complex each year. So this year, the management of supply chains is more complex than last year. And next year, it will be more complex than it is this year. And why is that? Well, it's that way for a number of reasons, but primarily due to outsourcing. Outsourcing is the process where customers will take activities that they have been normally responsible for and purchase those activities or those services from other suppliers. So what that does is that increases the number of companies that need to be managed in the supply chain. So outsourcing is a process that has been going on for some time. It will continue to go on, and for that reason, as well as other reasons, the management of supply chains becomes more complex each year. So let's take a look at a typical supply chain. Now, each industry will have a different supply chain. So what I'm showing in this slide is a retail supply chain, and I've chosen a retail supply chain because it's something I think we can all identify with. But different industries will have different supply chain, so we can't assume that the diagram shown in this will be the same for every industry. So a supply chain diagram is shown here. So we know a supply chain is the linkage of different companies that produce a product and deliver a product to a customer. So the most important person in the supply chain is the customer. And we put the customer over on the right-hand side of the diagram. So if we didn't have a customer to buy a product or a service, then we wouldn't need a supply chain. So in this example here, retail supply chain, the customer is going to purchase from a retailer. Now the retailer is going to keep certain inventories in their store, but they're not going to keep a tremendous amount of inventory. So at some point, when their inventories start to run low, they're going to need to reorder from someone else. And so they're going to need to reorder most likely from a distributor. So a distributor is the retailer's supplier, and the retailer is the distributor's customer. So in the supply chain diagram, the block to the right is always the customer, and the block to the left is always the supplier. So the distributor's role is to keep inventories in larger quantities and to deliver those inventories to their customer, in this case the retailer, whenever an order has been placed. Now the distributor eventually is going to run low of inventory, and they're going to need to order to resupply their inventory, and their supplier is going to be the original equipment manufacturer, or abbreviated in this slide as the OEM. So someone has to make the product in the first place, and that is the original equipment manufacturer. So the original equipment manufacturer, in order for them to be able to manufacture the product, they're going to need certain materials, certain components, certain raw materials in order to manufacture the product. So they're going to be ordering those from their suppliers. Now, this diagram is very simple. It's easy to understand, but in actuality, it is much more complex. So, for example, if you go back and you take a look at the retailer is not doing business with just one distributor. The retailer has many different distributors that they are working with. They could have potentially a different distributor for every product that they sell. And the distributor, they're not working with just one OEM, they're working with many OEMs. And the OEMs, they're not just working with one supplier, they're working with many suppliers. And the suppliers themselves, do you think that they have suppliers? And the answer is yes, they have suppliers. So we could extend this supply chain diagram and continue to move it back in the supply chain. And even those suppliers have suppliers. So when adding all these different elements, we get a feel for the complexity of the supply chain. Now, the last thing I'd like to discuss in this part is to discuss the three flows that take place in a supply chain. There are three flows, and they're shown in this diagram. The first one is shown up at the top, and that is an information flow. And you can see that the information flow, there's an arrowhead on both ends of the line. And that indicates that information flows in both directions in the supply chain. The part of the supply chain where the customer is, we refer to that part of the supply chain as the front end of the supply chain. And the supply chain to the back, where the suppliers are, and so forth. We refer to that as the back end of the supply chain. So information flows from the front end to the back end, and it also flows from the back end to the front end. It flows in both directions. So what information is flowing in both of these directions? Well, the information that flows from the front end, the customer, down to the back end is forecast or demand information. So the retailer has to have some type of forecast of what the customer is going to be buying. And the distributor has to have some type of forecast of what the retailer will be ordering from them. And the OEM has to have a forecast of what the distributor will be ordering from them, and so forth. The information that is flowing from the back end to the front end is supply information. That is the availability of the supply. So once a forecast has been determined of what your customer's expectations or demands will be, then each party in the supply chain has to determine whether or not they can meet that supply. Can they supply it, yes or no? So the information that's flowing from the back end to the front end is supply information. So you may ask for a certain quantity and a demand. I may or may not be able to meet that. If I can't meet it, this is what I can meet. This is the quantity that I can give you, or this is the date that I can give it to you, which may be different from the date that you really want it. Another flow in the supply chain is shown just below the diagram, and that is the material flow. And you'll notice on the material flow that the arrow is pointing to the right. So in a material flow, the material flows from the back end of the supply chain to the front end of the supply chain. So the suppliers are going to be supplying the components and raw materials to the OEM. OEM manufactures the product. They're going to ship the finished product to the distributor. The distributor is then going to be shipping the finished product to the retailer, and then finally the customer will be buying from the retailer. Now, the only exception to the material flow is in the case of what is sometimes referred to as reverse logistics. Reverse logistics. So that is an example of returns, either for warranty purposes or for whatever reason. So if the customer buys something and it is damaged, doesn't work properly, it's in warranty, then they're going to return it to the retailer. The retailer is going to return it to the company that they bought it from. They're going to return it to the company that they bought it from. So that is a only exception to the material flow. So in reverse logistics, it actually flows the opposite direction. But for the purposes of our course, what I want you to understand is that the material flow generally flows from the back end to the front end. And then finally, the third flow we'll discuss is the financial flow. And of course, that's the money. So the customer, the financial flows from the front end, the customer, to the back end. So the customer is going to pay for the product or the service that they purchased from the retailer. Retailer is going to take that money and they're going to be using it to pay their distributor. Distributor will take that money, use it to pay the OEM. OEM takes that money, uses it to pay the supplier. So the money is flowing from the front end to the back end. So this will conclude Part C of this unit.